Hi, I'm Sensei Tony, and welcome to the House of Meditation. Namo Furuos, Namo Furuos, Namo Furuos, Namo. Let us celebrate the liturgy of the day. Let us share the peace. May all beings awaken to that peace which is our true home. Let us take refuge. I take refuge in the ground of being, within which I live and move and breathe. Let us make the accord. I take sanctuary in the heart of being, accepting all of my delusions in thought, word, or deed, born of ignorance, hatred, and greed. Let us give thanks. I give thanks for all things, awakening to the interbeing of all nature. May my heart be open and my mind clear. May all be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and may all come to know that peace which is born of insight and understanding. Since it is the practice of enlightenment, that practice has no beginning, and since it is enlightenment within the practice, that realization has no end. Tonight we continue with the next chapter in my newest book, The Three Principles of Oneness, How Embodying the Cosmic Perspective Can Liberate Your Life. Tonight we begin chapter 10. And this quote is by the philosopher Plutarch. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. So tonight's talk, we're going to look at the discovery of fire by human beings and the meaning of that for the evolution of human consciousness. Now I'm going to talk about two different discoveries of fire. The first discovery is the one where our ancient human ancestors first learned how to work with fire. The second discovery of fire, as I call it, is going to be looking at the awakening of Shakyamuni and the impact that that has had on human civilization. So let's begin with the first discovery of fire. One thing we know, at least from archaeological evidence, is that about 2 million years ago, it seems that humans began to have at least a rudimentary use of fire. And then a little bit later on, about 300 and some thousand years ago, it became evident that there was some indication that this use of fire was being used in ways that were helpful to them. So not just as perhaps something to warm themselves with, but something that they began to actually use. And then about 125,000 years ago, in caves in the Levant, in the Middle East, in Israel, really good evidence came that humans had, by that time, learned to completely curate fire, or to be able to not only care for it, to create it, but to use it in various ways. So that's a long time ago, especially when you consider that, at least right at this time, archaeology doesn't really think that any major civilization existed before 11,000 years ago. So the idea that humans were using fire that long, it's pretty incredible. Now, how did this use of fire come about? Well, this is the best picture that archaeologists and anthropologists have been able to put together, not only by looking at the fossil evidence, but also looking at the way that modern apes, particularly chimpanzees, use fire. I say use fire loosely, how they relate to fire. So one of the things that, one of our theories of human evolution is that at one point our planet, and at least the areas where the humans were, was a very tree-like environment. And that humans, like some modern apes today, mostly lived in the trees. Pardon me. And then there was a point, again, due to some type of climate change, where those forest situations changed and it became more of a savanna. And in a savanna, you don't have as many trees. It's very hot, it's very dry. And so one of the things that probably occurred more often then were fires. Now, how would these fires have started? Sometimes they would have started by having lightning strike, and lightning hitting a tree and then catching on fire. Another way that it may have happened is just by spontaneous brush fires that can still happen today. And so the early hominid humans became familiar with what was happening. Now, the first thing that they probably did was what's called fire foraging. And fire foraging, basically, chimpanzees even today, if there's a brush fire of some sort, they have learned to go near that fire to use it in a way mainly for food. So there'll be food that gets heated or burned slightly, and they will go after that. So there's no doubt that that's probably how our human ancestors began working with fire, through food foraging. The second development was probably putting foodstuff in the fire. In other words, finding a way to take foodstuff, put it into the fire for a certain period of time, and then take it back out. And again, we're talking about, good Lord, hundreds of thousands of years. So even a relatively unintelligent group could probably figure that out at some point. And they did. And it's very interesting that this correlation between the second stage, where food itself was used in fire, and there was probably a deeper understanding of how fire actually works, and perhaps even cultivating fire, that humans began to change their diet. Now, hunter-gatherer tribes and groups that humans represented probably ate whatever was available. So they probably foraged, and they probably hunted. And more than likely they were omnivores. And when they learned to cook their food, particularly cook meat, and they began to eat meat on a more regular basis, that changed human evolution. In other words, as humans began to eat meat and cook that meat, they began to grow differently. And so many anthropologists believe that that really kind of started off a sort of Cambrian explosion in terms of awareness, because the brain itself developed and grew. And it probably led to the actual physical growth of humans as well. So a very, very important stage. And then the next stage after this was the curation of fire, which means that not only would they be working with fire that maybe started naturally, but they would have actually learned how to make fire and learned how to take fire from one place to another. Now, it is possible, before they really learned how to make fire themselves, and I personally hold to this hypothesis, that when a flame became available, almost magically, through a brush fire, through a lightning strike, that the humans would have gotten very careful about keeping that flame alive. And I think that was a very important stage in the curation, because you see elements of that impact the way that humans dealt with fire later on. So I think there was a real sort of understanding that fire was the most important thing that they had to work with. And so they would have given it top priority in its curation. So what were the various things that early humans got from fire before, as the aforementioned change in diet? Well, one thing that it did was it offered them protection. Most wild animals will not come near someone who is waving fire. And so these fires would have offered them a level of protection that they didn't have before. The other thing that it did was it offered warmth, which would have allowed our ancestors, as they migrated to more northern climes, where the temperature would have been a lot colder, it allowed them to do so by using fire to provide warmth and comfort. And along with the curation of fire, the cooking that developed along with this, I believe that there were practices that developed that we might eventually call shamanism, where there were keepers of the flame, individuals who were chosen to take care of the fire, to make sure the fire did not go out, and then probably to ritually create new fires. And I think that powerfully, this may have been the beginnings of what we call today liturgy. I mean, think about it. This element, this fire, was the thing that their entire civilization hinged on. So the focus on fire would have been tremendous. And the keeping of the flame and the curating of the flame, or the creating of new flames, would have been so central to those early human tribes. And so I believe, as many anthropologists do, that this was the beginning of what we might call liturgical acts. The fire became a sacred object. Now, we know this as a fact because our earliest roots that we can study around religion were the Indo-European. And for them, the flame was the most sacred object. So we know this is an idea that probably went on for tens of thousands of years. Another thing that fire offered, which was very unique, was it allowed humans to rest and reflect. In other words, before there was fire and the curation of fire, humans would not have had the ability to relax very much. And I believe that fire allowed our early human ancestors time to reflect, time to tell stories, time to study the sky. And it's even true this day for some primitive tribes that still exist, that live very much in a sort of early Neolithic style. They don't speak very much during the day. There's not a lot of conversation because most of the day is devoted to surviving, the things they need to do, the hunt, etc. But in the evening, when the fires are made and the fires are drawn and people circle and sit around these fires, that's when they talk. That's when they get into big conversation. That's when they seem to relax. They eat, they drink, they're merry. And so we know that this is how it occurred. And so these concepts are not something that we really have to work too hard to guess at because the evidence is so prevalent. Another thing that it probably created was the beginning of human society. And most of the time, when anthropologists are talking about this, they discuss it in terms of a division of labor. And so this curation and keeping of fire also created a division of labor. So you would have had those who were hunters, those who gathered the fuel, the wood or different elements they used for burning, those who cooked the food, and those who were the sacred keepers of the flame. So it created a real division of labor and probably the beginnings of human culture. When we get into the specifics of the shamanistic development, one of the things I've been saying for a long time, and I recently read, I've been saying this literally for about 30 years, and I recently read, just within the last year or so, some other anthropologists and scientists who are agreeing with me and saying that the keeping of fire and that phenomena that we all experience when we stare into a campfire or into a fireplace or at a candle, that probably, according to these new theories, and my original theory, was the origin of meditation, of trance states. And one scientist believes that this may have even encouraged pondering and deeper thinking. Pretty cool. And along with meditation and reflection, storytelling would have developed around the fire. And we still do that. Anytime if you go out camping, you set up a campfire, it's what we do. We tell stories. I like to tell ghost stories around a campfire, but we tell stories. And this storytelling begins to create a cultural narrative. And furthermore, this type of activity then could have led to the establishment of codes of conduct. In other words, not only developing a cultural narrative, but the meaning of that narrative. And in some ways, it was taking how things work and bringing them together with why things matter. How the fire was first founded, how it was a gift, and what it meant to live together. So that's the first discovery of fire. So you can see how incredibly powerful this is. Now I want to talk about what I consider the second discovery of fire. Just as powerful, equal to, or even more so than the first discovery. And this is what we call the awakening, or the satori, of the Buddha Shakyamuni. His awakening to this, what we talk about as a cosmic perspective and oneness, and the curation of the fire of the mind. And this curation of the fire of the mind, which also can be understood as the psyche or spirit. This curation led to the beginning of not just an insight, but a systematic way to help others to experience that same insight. So when Shakyamuni has his big experience looking up at the stars, sitting under the Bodhi tree, and he sees the morning star right before dawn, he has his powerful awakening where he realizes that all things are one. And then out of that experience, he then has to find a way that others can have a similar understanding. And it was very clear, I think two things were very clear. One was that his experience was universal. In other words, he wasn't saying or claiming that his experience was the only time that humans have ever had this. But what was unique about his experience is because it was the first time in human history where someone took this insight of oneness and applied it in a systematic form, and creating what we might even call proto-psychotherapy, where the insights, the cosmic perspective, that was brought in and embodied through a way of life that became known as mindfulness. and this changed the world. Many people don't realize how powerful this insight was. Scholars today are just now beginning to affirm what many of the ancient teachings imply, is that the awakening of the Buddha, the second discovery of fire, changed civilization. And even if those forms were not carried out directly through the Sangha, they were adopted. The ideas and some of the patterns were adopted by others. They were adopted in Greece, and then they were adopted in Levant, and then in Northern Asia, in Southern Asia. And these ideas changed the world. And this is something I like to talk about, and I make sure that all my seminarians are very aware of, that the Dharma, or the teaching of the Buddha, is not foreign to us. And in fact, I would argue, underpins some of our most precious philosophies. So this occurred in history about 3000 BCE. So paralleling the first discovery of fire, I'm going to go through various points and show you in my mind, the interesting parallels that might be useful. Number one, as our ancestors went from the forest to the savanna and began fire foraging, you can look at the story of Shakyamuni as the hero's quest and the initial experience of what we call psychic eruptions. In other words, what drove Shakyamuni into the forest to try to find an answer to the question of suffering, to find himself, if it were. This began through an eruption, various eruptions that we call the four sights. This was the experience of seeing someone who was old, seeing someone who was sick, seeing someone who had died. The experience of his commitment to his wife and the birth of his son, Rahula. And the experience of someone who seemed to be happy because they had left behind the concerns of the world. These were eruptions that occurred to Shakyamuni and drove him into the forest to find an answer. And so this hero's journey, this hero's quest begins through these eruptions. And I liken that to our ancestors first beginning to experience fire and fire foraging. Secondly, the development of foodstuff and the use of fire and how fire works became the spiritual technology that Shakyamuni discovered through his awakening. And as he began to put together this system of teaching, this system of psychotherapy, of realizing that suffering and the answer to suffering and the end of suffering was in the mind, that it could not be found outside of the mind, that this world out here could only be manipulated so far. But there was a point where that manipulation was no longer successful. And so the thing that had to be trained was the mind. And so in the four direction system of mindfulness, we teach these basic concepts and ideas through mindfulness models. And these mindfulness models that emerge from this experience that Shakyamuni had, I liken to how people began to cook with fire. Because one of the things you learn when you're practicing the four directions, when you're practicing the way of mindful living, is you begin to cook your life. You begin to really work with it in a way that you probably hadn't before. And third, just as the curation of fire, which led to a great number of different things, this way of mindful living led to a number of great things. And again, I'm making parallels from each of these with this discovery, the second discovery of fire. So, in our ancestors, the first discovery was warmth and protection. In the technology of mindfulness, the creation of mantra and meditation and mindfulness began to be a way, just as those early fires for our ancestors created warmth and protection, the practice of meditation and mindfulness and mantra. Mantra itself, the Sanskrit word meaning to protect the mind. This was a parallel that emerged from this spiritual technology that was eerily similar to the early things that humans learned from the curation of fire. Our early ancestors learned to eat meat, which created larger brains, and then there was hunting and early forms of magic related to hunting so that a hunt would be better. And we see this in some of the cave paintings that we find. And so the development of liturgy and the development of practices where our mind and the environment were brought together as one. These practices would have emerged and did emerge through the Buddhist community as liturgy. And that's why we practice liturgy. Liturgy is something that is ancient and old, and it is a way for humans to gather together, to experience being one with each other, and to learn, and to hear the teachings over and over again, and to live out the mythic narratives which create a foundation for our own path, for our own hero's journey. And just as fire for our ancestors expanded exploration to different climes and allowed them to develop astronomy and astrology, which was connecting astronomy to their individual lives. Likewise, the Buddhist path helps you to see your life itself as the path. As we say in our precepts, you realize that your path is the teaching. In Japanese Zen, the word that's used to refer to this is koan, or genjo koan. Your life becomes your koan. It becomes the thing that as you work with it, as you cook it, as you allow the fire of awakening to cook your life, it leads to liberation. It leads to a greater sense of equanimity and a deeper experience of the joys of life. Just as division of labor helped create society and culture for our early ancestors, the Sangha became a societal microcosm. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize, that the society, the intentional communities that were created by the Buddha and the Buddha's followers, which we call Sangha, those communities became a microcosm for a new way of being. And in some ways you could say that the Dharma was not just about personal liberation, but was a way to create a society of freedom of expression. And so what did that look like? Well, at the center, and I think of it like a circle rather than a hierarchy, I think of it like a circle. At the center were the clergy, were those who were ordained, those who were trained, those who were the bloodline of the Buddhas, who would keep the tradition alive from one generation to the next, so that these precious teachings would never disappear, so that each new group, each new human would be able to experience the joy and liberation of the Dharma. The economic picture of these early sanghas involved, in different settings, different ways of doing things. In some sanghas, it was much more of a, what we might say, farming experience, where they would go out and they would hold up their alms bowl And there was a structure in their culture that everybody gave alms to people. Because in ancient India, when you reached a certain age, like about my age, it was common for you to give all your worldly goods to your children and begin to just spend the rest of your life preparing for your next spiritual evolution. And so everybody's parents were doing that. So when someone came to your door with an alms, you gave them something because you knew it was someone's dad, someone's mom. And the Buddhist community would use that in some settings. And sometimes they had patronage that helped provide for these things. Other times they didn't. They required more of a hunter perspective, where they actually had to create their own ways of business and commerce, just as the early Chinese communities did. They didn't have an infrastructure, so they had to be creative in growing crops and providing services that would allow them to have a lifestyle, to live, to make their living. And these models we see reflected in modern human society, very much the same. There was a great emphasis on the individual, in the individual's rights. This was a major shift in most of the philosophies that you find among humans, where the herd or the group dynamic was the most important. And the Buddha's emphasis on the sovereignty and the, one might say, the rights, the inherent dignity of the human being as Buddha began a move away from this collective ideology into one that was more individualistic and recognizing the group as individuals who have intentionally agreed to be together and not as some forced form of conformity. Powerful stuff. The early Sanghas were the earliest experiments in democracy and in individual rights that we find in human history. They were copied by the Greeks, and so the names for these terms, like democracy, come down to us from the Greeks, but they originated in the Sangha. That's something that's really important for people to understand. And that the politics were based on a representative form of democracy, that regardless of where you came from, your caste didn't matter in the Sangha. Now, there was a hierarchy of the clergy, but that was based on experience. So the elder groups were at a higher point in the hierarchy of the clergy, and of course the newer trainees were down. But that shifted constantly. But the actual decision process of how they made decisions as a group was done by individual representation in a parliamentary form of democracy. That's pretty wild. That's something that people really need to know, because this is history, but most people don't know that. They don't know that this is where this began. This is where that shift started. And lay people represented the larger Sangha, with the clergy serving that Sangha, and the Sangha providing for the clergy, which is another dynamic that we began to see later on in other groups. And finally, just as the early first discovery and curation of fire began shamanism with the keepers of the flame, meditation, the practice of reflection, storytelling, and codes of conduct. Likewise, the second discovery of fire by Shakyamuni began the order of the ordained, such as our order, the order of the Dragonfly. It began the practices of contemplation, and how contemplation was a way to both confront and create new ways of thinking and being. It was the creation of a narrative, of a story. And we know, and we're not certain how, but we know very much that probably the most popular narrative on this planet, which is that of the story of Christ, probably came from the story of the Buddha. It's just too hard to explain away the similarities, which you do not find anywhere else. So even the narrative of the story is something that has impacted our world in a way that most people don't realize. And finally, the establishment of precepts. The Sangha lived by a code of conduct known as the precepts. And the precepts were basically to not intentionally harm and, if possible, to help. And those guides became the foundation of practice, recognizing that human beings are all at different levels of awareness. And in order for us to live peaceably together, it's important for us to have some common codes of conduct based upon the idea of not intentionally harming each other, and hopefully inspiring us to help each other. So, in summary, this is the way that those two things parallel, and that's why I saw that at some point in my studies, and I began to see that the early discovery of fire by humans, which changed everything, was parallel to the second discovery of fire by Shakyamuni, where the mind was not so much, as Plutarch said, something to be filled like an empty vessel, but rather a kindling to create that spark of awakening, so that the mind burned with enlightenment. So I hope you'll reflect on that, learn more about how this kind of cosmic perspective, learning about how our human evolution and the experience of our practices have so many parallels that I find both comforting and inspiring. The moment we receive true and trusting, solid and clear like a diamond, infinite light and life embrace and protect us, liberating us completely. Let us share the 4 immeasurable vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Delusions are endless, I vow to end them. The ways of compassion and wisdom are boundless, I vow to embody them. The way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. Let us share the precepts for the community of the vow. I allow my true self to manifest in all aspects of life. I take complete responsibility for my own life and all of my actions. I affirm my personal being and acknowledge it as a path to awakening and freedom. I embrace all aspects of my personal being, including my shadow, so that they may be transformed. I affirm an attitude of openness to my true self, even in the midst of suffering. We will now commence with the offering of incense, and while we're doing that, we will chant the mantra together, and please make your own offering at your home altar. After we have finished, as usual, we will conclude with a period of abiding. Gate, gate, pedagate, gate, gate, bodhiswa, gate, gate, pedagate, pedasangate, bodhiswa. Samgate Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, gate, gate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, gate, gate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, Pedasangate, Bodhisattva. Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, gate, gate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, gate, gate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, gate, gate, Bodhisattva. Gate, gate, Pedagate, Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. Pedasamgate, Bodhisattva. knowing that we never practice alone. The practices of the ancient ones and the practices of those today, wherever you may be, wherever you are, they are all united in one consciousness. May we always offer our own practice, not just for our own sake, but for the world. Let us do so by reciting the Bodhisattva Gata. We dedicate this practice to the welfare of all beings throughout space and time. May it always be so. Nam Mô Buddhadharma. Nam Mô Buddhadharma. Nam Mô Buddhadharma. That now concludes our service. Thank you once again for joining me. I hope that you found the talk useful. And as always, I recommend that if you would like to help support our work and what we do, we function very much just like a church or a temple. You can go to AskSenseiTony.com and you can go to the Sangha page and make a donation. You can also become a member of Lion's Gaze, which is a monthly donation that really helps us a lot. And there are special talks on there, just for our members. So again, may you be blessed and have a good week. Thank you.